Hello everyone, my name is Michael Todd and I'm the editor of Social Science Space. Today I'd like to welcome you to the webinar Washington DC and the Social and Behavioral Sciences, the Picture of 2016. Our guest is Senior Vice President of the Washington Government Relations firm CRD Associates, Mark Feith. Let me begin with a slight further introduction of Mr. Feith. Mark Feith is a Senior Vice President of the Washington Government Relations firm CRD Associates. He was a longtime staffer of 14 years in the House of Representatives, including time as Chief of Staff for then-Congressman Robert A. Borski of Pennsylvania. Since he joined CRD in 2002, Mark has specialized in bringing diverse associations, foundations, institutions of higher education, and other stakeholders together to advocate for common objectives. Of greatest interest today is his role as coordinator of the National Social and Behavioral Science Collaborative, which is fighting to keep all government-supported science be reviewed by scientists and to be funded properly. This one-hour webinar will be recorded and archived for future viewing. We'll be sending out a link to view it and access the slides to all registrants in the coming weeks. In the meantime, if any of you have any problems with audio or viewing mode during the webinar, please use the Q&A box on the right of your screen and one of our helpful team members will get back to you ASAP. At the end of the webinar, we will have some time for Q&A from attendees, so please also use the Q&A box to ask any questions of speakers throughout the webinar. Please also take note of the webinar hashtag SageTalks and feel free to ask questions or leave comments there. And without further ado, I'd like to pass it over to Mark.
Thank you, Michael. Bear with me a second. I'm just bringing up my slideshow here. It's really a pleasure to have everybody join into this webinar today. I hope I can provide you with some insight on what has happened in the past and what is going to happen this year and what may happen in the future with respect to federal support for social and behavioral science research. And today I will primarily focus on the research that's funded out of the Social, Behavioral, and Economic Sciences Directorate, or SBE, at the National Science Foundation. So I'd love to leave plenty of time for some good questions and lively discussion, so I'm going to get right into my presentation. What I will go over today is, first I'm going to talk a little bit about what the SBE Directorate is. I'm going to get into some of the funding history behind social sciences, and particularly some of the skepticism and attacks that have been levied against the SBE enterprise and NSF. And then I'll talk a little bit about the President's FY17 budget, which was unveiled last week, and what that means for not only NSF, but specifically for the SBE Directorate. And finally, I will end with a discussion about the challenges that I think we face this year and beyond. But first, let me do a quick overview of the SBE Directorate. SBE, again, stands for Social, Behavioral, and Economic Sciences. As many of you probably know, there are 6 research directorates at NSF that are organized along scientific discipline lines. But the SBE Directorate is by far the smallest of these 6 directorates. You'll notice here that there is a line item in the NSF's budget which is research and related activities, which really funds all the research at NSF. That's a $6 billion line item. Of that amount, SBE is only $272 million, which is only 4.5% of the research budget at NSF. The next highest funded directorate is the Biological Science Directorate, which, as you can see, is more than twice that amount at $744 million. And to sort of give you a visual understanding of this, this bar graph shows you the NSF's budget and how it's divided. If you see this red line across here, this is the SBE Directorate. And these 5 bars underneath all represent the other research directorates, as you can see, significantly higher than the SBE Directorate. But although it's a very small directorate, it is extremely important to the SBS community. And in fact, the NSF funds 67% of all social and behavioral science research at our nation's institutions of higher education. If you compare that with some of the other scientific disciplines, you will see that computer science, of course, has the highest level, relies on 82% of NSF grants, but not too far behind our social sciences at 67%. And you can see engineering and physical sciences are at a much lower level, around 40%. So if you look at the most recent completed years of grant funding, you have to look at FY15. There were 640 grants funded by the SBE Directorate, but this was only a 21% funding rate, which means that approximately 80% of grant applications that were submitted to the SBE Directorate were not funded, which of course suggests that a lot of good science is unfortunately not funded because of lack of resources at the SBE Directorate. So the Directorate is also divided into 4 divisions, and I think this is important to understand where the money goes. The 2 on the top here, social and economic sciences and behavioral and cognitive sciences, these are the divisions that really fund the bulk of SBS research at the Directorate. The Directorate also houses the National Center for Science and Engineering Statistics. This was done by statute. The America Competes Act of 2010 housed the center at the SBE Directorate. And then there's also an Office of Multidisciplinary Activities that funds research that crosses over not only SBS science, but other scientific disciplines. So there's been a long history of attacks on the SBE program. You can go back to the Reagan years, and even earlier than that, Senator Proxmire, of course, had his famous Golden Fleece Awards, and many of the grants that he identified were social science grants that ultimately had great utility and value to our country. But I wanted to share with you 3 relatively recent quotes that kind of give you an idea of what we're up against. And this first one was a real clarion call to our community from the former Majority Leader Eric Cantor, a speech that he made to the American Enterprise Institute, where he's suggesting that basically all federal funds for social science should be diverted to finding cures for diseases. In that same year, we saw the ascension of a new chairman to the House Science Committee, Congressman Lamar Smith from Texas. And in a letter that he wrote in March of 2013 to the House Budget Committee, he pretty much identifies his position right here, which is he is skeptical really of the value of SBE funding and really believes that a prioritization should exist and that more funds should be channeled over to the physical sciences instead of the social and behavioral sciences. And then more recently, at the beginning of 2015, we saw a new chairman to the Commerce, Justice, Science, Appropriations Subcommittee in the House, Congressman John Culberson, who is a very strong advocate of science, but in an LA Times interview, he made this quote, which suggests that in some ways the value of a grant may have a higher purpose by being viewed in a headline, a New York Times, or in a tweet than the actual substance and core of the science. So this quote is not a direct attack on SBE, but it gives you an idea of the mindset of a number of members of Congress as they view the grant portfolios of NSF. So what I'll talk about next is some of the congressional activity that has occurred in the last couple years. And really it's been 3 relatively recent arenas that we've been operating under. So I'll talk a little bit about the America Competes reauthorization process. Then I'll talk about the annual appropriations process for the Departments of Commerce and Justice and the science agencies, which include NSF. And then a more recent development, a bill called the Scientific Research in the National Interest Act. First, let me talk about the America Competes reauthorization process. The America Competes Act is the statute that really sets policy and overall funding ceilings for the National Science Foundation and other science agencies. This statute actually expired more than a year ago, and Congress for the last couple of years has made several attempts to reauthorize this statute. The most recent of this happened last year at the beginning of the year. The House Science Committee, which has jurisdiction over America Competes, began the process of marking up a reauthorization bill, again under the guidance of Chairman Lamar Smith. They approved a bill on May 8th, 2015, and the full House approved the bill on May 20th of 2015. What's very significant about this bill, it was very problematic to the scientific community for many reasons, but probably the most important reason is that under previous practice of Congress really set a ceiling on the research and related activities line item of the National Science Foundation, but did not include specific funding levels for each of the 6 research directorates at NSF. This bill broke with that precedent and actually included specific funding levels for each of these directorates. And as you might have guessed, based on the quote that I just showed you from Chairman Smith, the real loser in this process was the SBE Directorate. The funding level that was included in the House bill actually represents a 43% cut over existing levels. So if this had been enacted, it obviously would have had a devastating impact on the SBE Directorate. But fortunately, since the House approved this last May, there's been very little action taken to move this bill any further in the process. The Senate Commerce Committee has jurisdiction over America Competes, and the committee has pretty much indicated that it is not going to bring up the House bill, and that they instead would prefer to craft their own legislation that would be very different from the House bill and likely more friendly to the SBE Directorate. However, since that time, the committee has held a couple of listening sessions with the community, with the science and higher ed community, but has not yet drafted a bill. To date, as we speak, there is no Senate draft of the America Competes reauthorization bill. And it appears that the Senate really will not take any action on America Competes anytime soon. We're operating under a very accelerated and compressed calendar now in the House and the Senate, and it's more likely that this legislation will be punted to the next Congress and next year. However, one thing we have to always deal with on an annual basis is the annual appropriations process. And as I mentioned, the National Science Foundation receives its appropriation under the annual Commerce, Justice, Science Appropriations Act. Now, as I mentioned earlier, it's been a precedence for Congress to not include specific funding levels for the research directorates at NSF, and this is particularly true in the appropriations process. So when we started working on tracking this bill last year, the good news was that neither the House nor the Senate included specific appropriations line items for each of the directorates. But when Congress, when the Appropriations Committee considers an appropriations bill, one of the things it does is it issues what's called a report that accompanies the bill that provides guidance to the agencies for how they should spend their money. And unfortunately, the House bill last year included language that was very cleverly written, but if you read between the lines, would have represented a 16.5% cut for the combined SBE and Geosciences Directorate. So this legislation was approved by the House last June. The Senate, thankfully, had no cuts and no identical report language in their version of the Commerce, Justice, Science Appropriations Bill. And thankfully, because of the hard work of the science and higher ed community, the final Omnibus Appropriations Bill that was enacted into law did not include the House language. That was removed from the final bill. But the compromise that was agreed to was essentially a freeze on SBE spending at $272 million. So in many ways, this was a very significant victory because it could have been a lot worse, but we are now stuck with a frozen budget for the SBE Directorate for fiscal 16. A more recent development is legislation called the Scientific Research in the National Interest Act. This is legislation that was crafted by Chairman Lamar Smith and was originally part of the House version of the America Competes Reauthorization Act. The motivation behind this legislation is Chairman Smith has been scrutinizing grants that have been awarded by NSF, and he's particularly focused on the SBE Directorate, and he believes that many of the grants that are issued are not worthy of federal funding and do not meet the national interest of our country. So what he's trying to do with this legislation is have a requirement that each and every grant that NSF issues must be certified as being in the national interest of our country. And within the legislative text of the bill, he includes several criteria that define exactly what that national interest is. So this bill was marked up by his committee last summer, but was actually very recently, last week, approved by the full House on largely a party line vote. The bill has been sent over to the Senate and has been referred to the Health Committee, which stands for Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions. This is a committee that has specific jurisdiction over NSF. Again, I think it's likely that this bill is probably dead on arrival. I don't think the Senate has any interest in bringing this up, but we will have to very closely monitor and see. So let's talk a little bit about the President's budget that was unveiled last week. And I'll talk first about the overall budget for NSF. The President's request is $7.964 billion. And this may seem like good news when you look on the surface. It's a $501 million increase over the FY16 level, or about 6.7%. But note here that the budget request is broken into two categories: discretionary spending and mandatory spending. I'll talk in a little while about what the difference is between these two types of spending, but I will tell you right now that the likelihood of Congress approving this mandatory amount of $400 million for NSF is very unlikely. If you take that out of the equation, really the discretionary increase for the NSF under the President's budget is only a 1.3% increase, and this would really just barely cover, if not at all, inflation. What is the difference between discretionary and mandatory? I think many of you on this webinar probably know the difference, but just to review, discretionary spending is spending that's included in the annual appropriations bills. And when Congress passed the bipartisan budget resolution last fall, they set a ceiling on the amount of discretionary spending that could be spent not only in FY16 but also in FY17. So that ceiling has already been set. Mandatory spending is spending that is outside of the appropriations process. And when we think of mandatory spending, we often think of entitlement programs like Social Security and Medicare. So these programs are not in the annual appropriations bills. They are not subject to spending caps. They are, funding is based on formulas that are approved by legislation. So what the President's budget is essentially proposing is a one-time piece of legislation that would set mandatory spending levels for a number of research and innovation programs throughout the federal government. And again, I think the likelihood of something like that getting approved is very, very slim in this environment. I will say, as we think about the overall context of NSF, it's important to know that the NSF receives approximately 50,000 grant proposals annually. It accepts only 12,000 of that amount and rejects 38,000. So as you can see, there is a demand here issue. The administration's heart is certainly in the right place in its desire to increase the budget for NSF, something that our community certainly supports. But unfortunately, the budget scheme that he is suggesting has a very slim chance of being enacted into law. So let's talk a little bit about what this means for the SBE Directorate. The President's budget request within the NSF budget, it's $288.8 million for SBE. This would represent a 6% increase in the SBE's budget. So that sounds like great news. But again, look at how this is divided among discretionary and mandatory. If you take this mandatory spending amount that has virtually a 0% chance of being approved, $16.36 million. If you take that out of the equation, you're only looking at $272 $0.41 million. This is essentially a freeze on spending over the FY16 amount. And actually, the entire discretionary increase that's included in the President's budget for SBE would go to this National Center for Science and Engineering Statistics that's embedded within the SBE Directorate. So what's next in the process? Because, again, this is an election year, a presidential election year, the schedule is very much compressed. It's very interesting. The political conventions fall in July this year, which is something I think that's very new. And because of that, it's really accelerated the budget and appropriations processes. So the appropriations committees will begin marking up their FY17 bills as early as next month. As I mentioned earlier, the discretionary spending ceilings are already set by last year's budget agreement, but there's been a bit of a wrinkle in this. In the House Republican Conference, there are those members, particularly members of the House Freedom Caucus, who would actually like to see lower levels enacted than the ones that were agreed to last fall. So they are pushing for a new budget resolution for fiscal 17 that would actually have lower levels, and if something like this were enacted, it would have significant downward pressure on NSF and particularly on the SBE Directorate. So again, as I mentioned, it's very unlikely that Congress will approve a one-time R&D mandatory spending bill per the President's budget. And I also think because of these ceilings that we're operating under for discretionary spending, that Congress will approve any significant new amounts of funds for NSF above and beyond the President's budget. It's going to be a very tight fiscal year. If Congress were to divert more funds to NSF, it would have to find cuts somewhere else in the discretionary budget. So what are the challenges that we face in this year and beyond? Again, I think the most important arena that we're going to be operating in is the annual appropriations process for the Commerce, Justice, Science bill. We need to do our best to try to preempt the inclusion, again, of damaging report language in the House Commerce, Justice, Science bill, and that's something we're working on, or any other types of mechanisms that would cut funding for the SBE Directorate. With America Competes, again, I think this bill is currently stalled, but you never know. There may be activity later on in the year to try to move this forward, and we'll be very vigilant and make sure that the Senate's version of the bill is much stronger than the House bill, if that should happen. The National Interest Bill, again, I don't see this moving beyond the House's approval last week, but it's something we need to monitor very closely. But one of the things that certainly will be ongoing that's not really in the legislative arena is the continued scrutiny of individual grants at the NSF. And this is something that Chairman Smith has been engaged in for several years, where he has pulled out examples of specific grants and questions the value of these grants to the overall mission of NSF. So the good news as we face these challenges is that social science really is a strong discipline of scientific funding, and I think everyone in the science and higher ed community believes that. Our stories speak for themselves. We have very strong evidence that grants that have been awarded by the SBE Directorate have had very significant utility to society at large. The science and higher education communities have been working very closely across all disciplines to deliver this message to Congress that politicians should not be picking winners and losers among the scientific disciplines, and that's largely due to the multidisciplinary nature of science. We no longer do science in silos. Many grants involve not only physical, biological, and chemical science components to it, but also social and behavioral science. So the science and higher ed communities have been united, and I anticipate they will remain united throughout the year as we face these challenges. We've also made some very significant inroads with key Republican offices in the House and the Senate, and I think that helped to make, for example, the vote last summer on the America Competes bill in the House was a lot closer than the proponents of that bill thought it would be. And largely that's because of the work of the universities. They've really done a great job of reaching out to their members of Congress particularly the state and public universities, many of whom are represented by Republican members in the House and Senate. And lastly, the Senate has sort of served in its traditional role as a bulwark against rash votes that are taken by the House, and that has certainly worked to our favor in the past few years. Most of the damaging things that the House has approved for social sciences has been stopped dead in its tracks in the Senate, and I think that is attributable to the inroads that we have made across the aisle with both Republicans and Democrats in the Senate. So while I think we have a lot to feel good about, we need to remain vigilant. You never know what's going to be on the horizon, and I look forward to taking anybody's questions and having a lively discussion on these issues. So I'll turn things back over to Michael.
Hey, thanks, Mark. It was a very informative presentation. I really appreciate it. We are going to take some time addressing questions from the audience, but as moderator, I get to use my big thumb on the control panel and ask a couple questions of my own. But I do ask that the audience continue to send in questions on the right side of your screen or at Twitter using the hashtag SageTalks, SageTalks. If we can't get to your questions by the end of the hour, by the way, our speaker has agreed to address them in a follow-up blog post that we'll put on Social Science Space and probably also on Sage's Sage Connection. But let me ask my first question, if you will, and it's just kind of a meta question going back. It's like, why social science? Why is social science in the crosshairs? You talked about it going back to the Reagan administration, and even when Vannevar Bush first came up with the conceptual idea for National Science Foundation, social science always had to take a seat at the back of the bus.
Yeah, that's a great question, Michael, and I think we're still trying to answer it. I'll answer it on several levels. The social science that's funded by the National Science Foundation is basic science. So it is very hard when grants are awarded to understand exactly what the applications of the research will be to our society, to our nation. A lot of times those applications don't happen until 5 or 10 years down the road, and they may often be very unanticipated applications, and we have many, many examples of that. I will say the most recent scrutiny of social sciences comes from, I would say two viewpoints, and if Chairman Lamar Smith were in the room with us right now, I think what he would say is, first of all, he's not against social science. He does believe that there is a role for NSF to fund social science. But he believes that in this tight fiscal environment that we need to prioritize sciences, and he believes that there is a higher value to society of the physical, chemical, biological, engineering sciences, what he would call hard sciences, and what he would call, he would call social science soft sciences. And he also views this from a competitive point of view, that he believes that we are more competitive with countries like China and India if we put more resources into those so-called hard sciences versus the social sciences. And again, a lot of this is also driven by his scrutiny of pulling out individual grants. I will also say that, sometimes he refers to grants that were not funded by SBE, but he uses them as criticism of SBE. So some of it is really inaccurate in its description.
Oh, quick housekeeping thing. I've been sending people to Sage Talks. We'll monitor that, but the actual one that we were hoping to use for this seminar, or for this webinar and for future ones, is hashtag Social Science Live. Apologies, but again, we will be monitoring them both. Let me go back to what you were talking about with Lamar Smith. During the recent talk on his national interest bill, there's some fairly compelling optics on his side. The idea, it's like the taxpayer should not have to write a blank check, or the idea that in this aid we want to be transparent, and the things that we can do to be more transparent should be on everyone's lips. So what are some of the issues in the social science and the broader science community concerns about that?
Yeah, that's a great question, Michael. I think there's two competing things going on here. Congress has oversight of all federal agencies, including the National Science Foundation. So the chairman is certainly right when he says it is his prerogative to exercise oversight over how NSF spends its money. But at the end of the day, really the most effective means of determining how dollars are allocated to specific grants is guided, from the top by the National Science Board, which really kind of sets a vision for where we should be going scientifically in our country. And that involves stakeholder input from the entire scientific community. And when you get down to specific grants, at the end of the day, ultimately, it's the merit review process that should be determining which grants are awarded and which grants are not awarded. So I think when members of Congress want to exercise their oversight prerogative, they go down a slippery slope of interfering with the merit review process and essentially having members of Congress decide which grants get awarded and which grants don't get awarded. And in many ways, this is a form of earmarking dollars to specific grants, or if you're looking to refuse dollars for specific grants, a form of reverse earmarking.
Mark, there's kind of an elephant in the room when we talk about this particular fight. Very literally an elephant in the room, that most of the concerns about social science funding come from the Republican side of the aisle, and I'm just wondering, when did this become a political issue? When did social science become a litmus test for your partisanship?
Yeah, and it really shouldn't be a political issue. And as I mentioned in our presentation, we have made a lot of inroads with the Republican offices, and I think if you look at this on the surface and you just look at some recent votes that have been taken, you might think that this has become a Republican and Democratic issue, and that's really not the case. Most of the Republican offices that we have talked to are very supportive of social and behavioral science. This is mostly coming out of the House Science Committee and from Chairman Smith. He's really the driving factor on this. And what you have to remember is that when a bill gets to the level of the House floor, it is very hard for Republican members to vote against a Republican chairman of a committee. So the fact that a number of them did really demonstrates that there's a deeper level of support within the Republican conference for not interfering with picking winners and losers among scientific disciplines. But at the end of the day, when your party asks you for your vote, it's very hard to say no. Again, I don't think we see that in the Senate, and this is why a lot of these votes have not had any traction in the Senate. Every Republican senator has a state university in their state that they listen to and they care about. So I think the dynamic is much different in the Senate. But I will end my answer to this question by saying that the community needs to do its best to demonstrate that this shouldn't be a partisan issue, that really scientific research is in the interest of our entire country, and Democrats and Republicans should be united behind funding scientific research.
Quick reminder to our audience that we are accepting questions either on the Q&A box on the webinar or using the hashtag on Twitter, Social Science Live. Mark, you were talking about the Senate being this deliberative body that kind of slows down the passions of the House. There's another deliberative body that slows down the passions of legislators, and that's the Supreme Court, which is certainly in the news now that there is a vacancy. Is there any role for, or perhaps let me rephrase that, how does the Supreme Court impact this discussion?
Yeah, I tell you, when we were putting together this webinar last week, we did not anticipate the political earthquake that happened over the weekend with the passing of Justice Scalia. As anybody who's reading a newspaper these days can see, this has already become a huge political issue, with the president indicating his intention to send a nominee for a new justice to the Senate, and Senate leadership basically saying there's no way we're going to do this year. So that dynamic sets up a potential for bleeding over into all issues that will be before the Senate, and particularly the appropriations issues. One of Majority Leader Senator Mitch McConnell's priorities this year is to actually follow regular order and get these appropriations bills done early, get them to the Senate floor for consideration early. That now is in jeopardy because Democrats in the Senate may find that filibustering that process may be the only leverage they now have in forcing the Senate to consider the president's nominee, whoever that may be. So yes, it's the new 800-pound gorilla in the room.
We have a lot of animals here.
Yeah.
So we are getting questions now from the audience, and the first one I'm going to pose to you from the audience is, what are the funding rates for the other directorates?
Yeah, so the other directorates actually fared pretty well in the last appropriations bill. The Congress actually did include an increase in research and related activities for the NSF in the FY16 appropriations bill, and a number of the I don't have the figures in front of me, but a number of the other directorates will likely receive increases from that bill, whereas SBE will be flat funded. So there is a, unfortunately, SBE is the smallest directorate right now. It'll be even smaller compared to the other directorates.
Yeah, I will say that it's interesting in listening to some of the hearings on this kind of STEM SBE divide, and I hate to use the hard versus soft science rhetoric that's so despised by so many, but I do hear a lot of that. And for example, you were showing that how much computer science is paid for by NSF, and it does seem like there does seem to be a love of STEM and a much less love for social science.
Well, and I'll correct you there, Michael. STEM, the S in STEM is science, and social science is a science. So we do fund STEM. So much of the research that's funded by SBE goes into educating our our future leaders of our country in the scientific field, and that includes social sciences. So SBE does fund STEM.
No, I appreciate the correction. Perhaps I should have get gadgets and pills. I'm wondering if you could break out the SBE funding by discipline, or is that possible?
I don't have those figures in front of me. I imagine by discipline the question refers to how much for social, how much for behavioral, how much for economics. You can go into the president's budget and deep into the justification documents and look at how the divisions are funded. Again, the two most important divisions for the purpose of our discussion today are the social science and the behavioral divisions, and those are completely flat funded in the president's budget.
Speaking of budget, so what happens when legislation like America Competes is not renewed? I mean, that seems to be a problem. I mean, how big of a problem is it? And is funding authorization just on a year-by-year basis? And so when this breaks down in a year, it's like, do we go to zero? What happens?
Yeah, and this is something that folks outside of the Beltway have a hard time understanding. And as someone who's worked inside the Beltway for a long time, I still have a hard time grasping. But basically, there are a lot of federal programs that are not authorized and that or have had their authorization expire for many years. Now, as long as the appropriators put money into those programs, it really doesn't matter if they are not authorized. But the big problem with not having a reauthorization is that the policy remains the same until the programs are reauthorized. So the vision that was laid out in 2010 by the America Competes statute really needs to be renewed. A lot has happened in our country in 5 years. So the scientific community would like to see a very robust and vigorous America Competes Reauthorization Act. We think it's a great opportunity for Congress to lay out a vision over the next 5 or 10 years as to how we are going to remain the world's preeminent scientific leaders. So by not doing a reauthorization bill, we don't put that vision forward. And I think that's the real damaging aspect of having an authorization expired and not renewed. It's not going to affect the annual funding for NSF or for SB as long as the appropriators continue to pass appropriations bills to set those spending levels.
So we've been really kind of NF-centric in our discussion, but there's a lot of social and behavioral science funding that goes on. National Institutes of Health, Department of Defense has several things, including the Minerva project. We have Department of Ed. What's going on with funding for social and behavioral science in those arenas?
Yeah, and that's a good point. You know, there are many places throughout the federal government for funding social and behavioral science research. The Department of Education has an Institute for Education Sciences, which is a very important organization for, you know, looking at how our schools operate, how we can improve education in this country. The NIH does a lot of behavioral research and as well as economics research. Health economics has become an incredibly important topic for addressing rising costs to our healthcare system. I will say that you know, a number of years ago, health economics came under attack at NIH, and there was a very strong response to that in Congress. Fortunately, we have not seen a recurrence of that in the last year or so, but it's something that we always need to keep our eyes on and remain vigilant on. And there are many organizations that are part of our coalition that care very deeply about those programs. So perhaps we can have a future webinar on those programs at some point.
Real quick, and I do have another question for the audience, but I mean, how broad is what I'll call our coalition? Is it just social and behavioral scientists, or do all scientists have are all scientists joined together in trying to protect some of the more exposed sciences?
Well, this has been a great part of this coalition. Really, just about every scientific discipline is represented in our coalition. We work hand in hand with groups that are involved in the physical, biological, engineering, computer sciences. Of course, the entire higher education community, the Association of American Universities, the Association of Public and Land-Grant Universities have been just tremendous organizations. AAAS has also been involved. So the coalition is very broad, and I will say, for example, when the America Competes bill was moving through the House, it was a united coalition. Everybody from the science community was completely firm in their opposition to that bill. There was not one discipline that wandered off and said, yeah, this is a good bill. Even some disciplines that might have benefited from the enactment of that bill did not agree with the approach that the chairman took, because again, it was Congress picking winners and losers among scientific disciplines. The two that were targeted in that bill were social sciences and geosciences. But who knows, you know, a couple years down the road, maybe something like astronomy will be targeted, or microbiology. So you never know, and that's why the science community has stayed united in opposition to these types of pieces of legislation.
So speaking of some of the, again, I use the term advisedly, hard scientists, but how does the extension of the research and development tax credit affect science research in those areas?
Well, I'm not an expert on the R&D tax credit, but you know, my understanding is that is really something for the private sector to benefit from. So companies that are involved in doing research and development can take advantage of that. And I know that a lot of those companies work with universities to take advantage of that tax credit. So I think tangentially it certainly helps the overall enterprise of science, but not really sure how it directly relates to SBE.
So a lot of what we've been talking about is what's being done to us, if I can make a big tent and put all of us in there. Maybe the questions we should be asking is, what can we do to reverse this? So let me read this next question in that sense. How can junior investigators get more involved with this issue, and also encourage senior investigators to use their influence to promote support from university leadership? And I like the way that question's framed. It's like, how can the most junior push the more senior?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Well, and I will say that from where I sit, I don't see a problem from university leadership. I have been very impressed with the level to which this issue, specifically social and behavioral science research, has been elevated to the deans and the presidents and chancellors of major university systems. They have all weighed in against this. But, you know, a junior investigator is a constituent to a member of Congress and to 2 senators. So they should feel free to weigh in on their own. They can take the time to email their members of Congress or come to Washington, D.C., talk a little bit about what their research is doing and why it's important to them personally. So this is not just an issue of funding science for science's sake. This has to do with supporting people's careers. This is important to American jobs, and I think the more that junior investigators can talk about that with their members of Congress, the better off they'll be. I would encourage them to continue to go through their channels of, you know, meeting with their leadership at their universities to make sure that they broaden and deepen the message that those university presidents deliver to their members of Congress. But they can also do this on their own.
And I'm wondering, another question that's come in is, like, what about the idea of the social and behavioral and the what I was calling the gadget and pill type scientists kind of coming together and collaboratively creating like multidisciplinary grant proposals? Does that make them a little bit more bulletproof when it comes to this process?
Well, I think that's already been happening. I mean, you can look all across NSF and look at the grants that are being awarded out of all the directorates. And like I said earlier, these are no longer done in silos. There are many grant applications that involve, you know, someone with a background in engineering, someone in chemistry, and someone in psychology. So this is already happening, and again, it really strengthens the argument for why NSF needs that flexibility, that they should not have their directorate funding levels set in stone by Congress. They need to be able to be nimble, to adapt to trends that are happening around the country, and to take the input again from the stakeholders in the National Science Board in how they allocate funding for research.
So we talked. We had talked earlier about what the Supreme Court vacancy might mean. There's another vacancy that's coming up this year. You might have heard about it. There apparently were people running for President of the United States, and I'm wondering what role the executive has, apart from signing or not signing bills, has in this. For example, I know that the Obama administration has started its own nudge unit, if you will, which has faced some derision, but on the whole seems like a positive way to take applications and show genuine value from social and behavioral science.
Yeah, you know, regardless of what happens on Election Day, we will have a new president, and I would, if anybody can predict at this moment who it's going to be, they have a magic crystal ball, because it's really hard to tell. You know, this issue has not really come up on the presidential trail, but you know, I think conventional wisdom would suggest that you know, if Hillary Clinton were elected president, she probably would, in her budget proposals, call for significant increases in the NSF. But you know, that may also happen if a Republican is elected to president. It's really hard to say. I mean, I think the good news on the political front is that overall, members of Congress from both parties, and I'm sure every presidential candidate, really sees the value of the federal investment in science and research in STEM. And I think regardless of who's going to be president, I'm optimistic that they will send a budget to Congress that will, at least at that higher level, suggest some strong investments for science.
Going back to the NSF and the SBE Directorate in particular, are there areas in the SBE Directorate which are funding priorities, whether directed by Congress or as directed just by the Merit Review? And I say that knowing that, for example, the Brain Initiative, for example, which maybe exists somewhat outside of the NSF universe, somewhat in and somewhat outside. But I'm wondering, are there areas of focus? Are there priority areas for the funding that we are seeing?
Yeah, I mean, across the divisions that I described at SBE, there's a lot of research that's sort of targeted into specific areas. And you mentioned the BRAIN initiative. Of course, there's a huge social science component to that. It's not just neurological, but it's also psychological. My understanding, if I remember correctly, is approximately 25 million of the SBE budget is allocated to the BRAIN initiative. So, those are the kinds of things that I think in our advocacy we can point to. There's also, a lot of research is focused on resiliency for helping prepare communities for crises, whether they're man-made disasters or natural disasters. And I think this is something that Congress really cares about. And, of course, anything that relates to national security these days and terrorism is going to have traction, particularly with Republican members of Congress. So, yeah, there are definitely some portfolios within those divisions that we can highlight where the research, I think, has a better connection to what Congress is looking for.
It reminds me of the cynical observation. Although true, it's a shame to let a crisis go and be wasted. So I look at things. There are so many things that even like Ebola or Zika virus or something like that look like medical or technological issues, but that in fact have a huge or even a predominant social science component.
Yeah, Michael, if I could interject there, the Ebola crisis did present a really great opportunity for our community to educate members of Congress about the multidisciplinary approach that our government took to address that crisis. Because it as important as it was to try to develop medical countermeasures, vaccines, and other medicine to this crisis and to send medical doctors into the field, it was also extremely important to have anthropologists on the field that could basically interpret for us why this Ebola virus was spreading so rapidly throughout Africa, and a lot of it was cultural. So, yeah, I mean, a terrible crisis, obviously, but it did give us a great opportunity to educate members of Congress about the role that social science can play in addressing crises.
And speaking of the role that people play, here's more in the form of a statement than a question that's come from the audience, but that when we talk about junior investigators getting involved, it's certainly in their interest, both career-wise and profession-wise, and even more meta, that they get involved with their professional associations and their societies to monitor legislative alerts and respond to requests to advocate with their members of Congress, with their specific members of Congress. So it's more broad-based and more geographic. And another thing that one of our audience has mentioned is several associations organize periodic Capitol Hill Day conferences, which is a great opportunity to meet with congressional members and staff and the associations that also take care of the logistics. And I know, for example, that one of Social Science Base's partners and someone that I know that you work with, COSA, has had a field day. But there are things like that where people can get their feet wet in the policy arena and lobby at the same time.
Yeah, and there's just nothing better than having folks come to Capitol Hill and do shoe leather advocacy. As important as it is for folks to send emails, there's really no substitute for folks who take the time to come to Washington to make their case directly with members of Congress and their staff. And I have a lot of experience working with those kinds of organizations, not only in the social science arena, but in other areas. And I really see results that come out of those types of activities. It's very important.
Yeah, I often wonder because I mean the cynical response is it's like that you walk in and they shake your hand and they give you a commemorative pen or something, and it's like, and they look very sage and put their hand on chin, and then we walk out, it's like, who was here? Oh, I forget. That's good to hear from someone that had been in a staff role that things do happen when constituents show up.
It may be idealistic to say this anymore, but one person can make a difference, and I've seen evidence of that. I have seen constituents come into an office and make a request after making their case of how the issue personally affects them, and then 2 weeks later, that member of Congress either co-sponsors the bill or signs onto the letter, responds positively to that request that just came from one person. So I think a lot of people are cynical and get discouraged by the process, but at the end of the day, you have to remember that these members of Congress work for you. They are there to represent your viewpoints, and if you sit at home and don't get involved, they're not going to help you. But if you take the time to at least write to them by email or visit them in Washington or in their home offices, it can really make a difference.
In that vein, what about like posts and petitions and open letters? Are those less effective because they're more generalized?
Yeah. I don't see a lot of value in petitions. I think a personalized letter is far more effective. I will tell everybody on this webinar who's not in the DC area that please don't send a letter by a U.S. mail. It'll get radiated and crispy, and it may never arrive. Everything is electronic now, so everything is by email. There's also, there's some good portals out there that you can go to. There's a site called popvox.com, popvox.com, and perhaps, Michael, we can send that out to the group later. But every time a bill gets introduced in Congress, PopVox automatically creates a web page for that bill that gives you the opportunity to go on and weigh in either for or against that bill, and that message goes directly to your congressional representatives. So that is, in many ways, one of the easiest and most basic ways of conveying your views to your members of Congress.
So we'll start to wind this down. I have one last question from the audience, and then at that point we'll close. And again, if you have other questions that have come in, it's like we will address those in a subsequent written communication. And everyone that has been a part of this webinar will get a link to share for an archived version. But with the scrutiny and low ratio of grant approval, are there particular geographic regions or topics that are more likely to get funded? And I know we talked about Congress is more interested, say, in Zika right now, or more interested in terrorism, but does that translate into how things are funded?
I think in the social science sphere, probably not. If this webinar were about CDC and NIH, I would say that anyone who's doing research on Zika should be talking to those agencies ASAP. I think in the social science sphere, certainly there's a role for social science in addressing those crises. So that's a really good question. I think anything that is topical will tend to rise to the top of the heap with NSF, but again, the science has to be sound. At the end of the day, a grant is going to be approved based on its scientific merit. So you may have the best idea in the world for how to address the Zika crisis, or you may have an idea of how to address the refugee situation in the Middle East. But if you don't have sound science behind it, it's not going to get funded.
I laugh. I remember during Deepwater Horizon as a journalist, I was bombarded with great ideas for how to stop that oil well from spewing into the Gulf. And sound science would have been a welcome filter. Anyway, that's about all the time we have for today. Again, I want to thank our guest, Mark V, and I want to thank everyone for joining us. And again, a special thank you to Mark and to our support staff of Tiffany and Camille. In the coming weeks, be on the lookout for an email that will include a link to view this webinar and slides, as well as answer some of the questions we don't have to get to today. And please feel free to share this with other people that perhaps that you think would benefit from knowing this. I particularly appreciated Mark's introductory bit because it's a fairly arcane process how some of these things come about, and it was useful to be reminded of to actually learn in the first place how these things come about and how the process works. And so please stay connected with us at Social Science Space, and we will have upcoming webinars in this focus on Washington, D.C. So again, thank you very much and goodbye.
Goodbye, thank you.
Thank you.